Hello, this video is one of the modules on offer as part of the Foundation Online Training course. Our unique course has helped over 10,000 people to study for their foundation exam, and the course consists of online lessons, videos like this one, quizzes and mock tests. To access our free course and to get the latest version of this video and our collection of videos, go to www.hamtrain.co.uk. Now, on with the module.
Hi, this is Kelly from Essex Ham and welcome to Foundation Online, getting you started with amateur radio. Here's what we'll be looking at in this module.
Hello, my name's Pete and I'll be your guide for this module.
Licence conditions. How to identify yourself properly on air, what bands and frequencies you can use, and your responsibility to the regulator, Ofcom.
This is Module 6 in the Foundation Online Training course. This one is a particularly important module as it covers 6 marks of the 26-question multiple choice exam, by far the largest section, so please do study this one carefully. In this module we'll look at the rules and regulations around amateur radio, the UK call signs, the Foundation schedule, and the requirements for EMF. First off, let's talk about Ofcom. Ofcom is the UK's TV and radio regulator and the provider of our amateur radio licences. Ofcom has the right to inspect your radio equipment. They can order the restriction or modification of your equipment, close down your station, and in extreme cases, even revoke your licence. A person authorised by Ofcom can require the licence holder to keep a log of their transmissions made over a specified period of time. This would typically be for situations of interference where Ofcom need a log to show the times that you are transmitting. And you must notify Ofcom immediately if you change your name, main station address or your postal address. To transmit using amateur radio, you must hold a valid licence and abide by its terms. The UK's amateur radio licence covers all 3 licence levels: Foundation, Intermediate and Full, and you must check in the licence what applies to you at Foundation. You'll be able to download a copy of your licence from the Ofcom website once you've passed your exam. You'll also need to download the licence terms and conditions, which is available from the Ofcom website. You don't need to pay for your amateur radio licence, and it is a lifetime licence. So how do you go about getting your licence? Well, once you've passed your exam, you go onto the Ofcom website and you create an account. You'll need to enter the candidate number, which will be supplied to you by the RSGB once you've passed your exam, and then you can log on, create your call sign and download your licence. It's a requirement of the licence that you log on to the Ofcom website every 5 years to check that your details are correct. To make sure you don't forget, we recommend that you do this more frequently. Let's look now at the rules for amateur radio. Amateur radio is for leisure only. It's not for any kind of commercial purposes. That means that business use and commercial advertising is not permitted. You must only communicate with other amateur radio stations. The playing of music, use of offensive language and/or threatening behaviour is not acceptable on amateur radio. And you must not cause undue interference to other radio users. Moving on to amateur radio messages. You must not broadcast messages for general reception. As an example of this, you can't do what the BBC does and make announcements, such as travel news or news bulletins, to multiple people or to anyone that may be listening. There are some exceptions to this. When calling CQ, this is how you call out to make an initial contact to talk to someone for the first time. Or in a group, or a net as it's known in amateur radio, of 3 or more amateurs where contact and identification has already been established. Moving on to where you can operate at Foundation. You can operate in and over the UK, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, including their territorial seas. The Foundation licence does not permit use in other countries or the territorial waters or airspace of other countries. For the exam, you should remember that most foreign countries do not routinely recognise the UK's Foundation licence. Looking at ships and aircraft in more detail, you can operate from aboard ships and aircraft that are registered in the UK, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man in international waters or airspace. You should note though that you can only operate on a ship or aircraft with the agreement of the captain or the person who for the time being is in control of the ship or the aircraft. Transmitting from aircraft is relatively new for the UK and it is only permitted at very low powers and not on all bands. For the UK we have Foundation, Intermediate and Full, and each one has its own different call sign. Let's look first at Foundation. The current call sign for Foundation is M7, for example M7ABC. Older call sign prefixes include M3 and M6. Moving on to the intermediate call sign. From the second half of 2025, the prefix for intermediate is M8. You will also see M9 issued for intermediate. For example, M8ABC. Until the second half of 2025, the prefixes for intermediate were a little bit clunky, which is why they've been phased out. Before 2025, the prefixes were 2-something-0 and 2-something-1. As an example, if you were transmitting from England, it would be 2E0 or 2E1. And we'll talk about the E in just a moment. And moving on to the current full UK call sign, that is M0, for example M0ABC. Older prefixes include M1 and M5, and also any call sign beginning with a G. So let's now do our best to explain what that E was doing in the intermediate call sign. On the screen now you'll find the regional secondary locators. These are optional, you no longer have to use them, but many people in the UK do still use these. Essentially, the second letter of the call sign would define which part of the UK you're transmitting from. So taking England first, the letter is E. So for a Foundation call sign, that could be ME7ABC. To be honest, the convention in England is not to bother with the E. The letter E is a fairly new optional extra that can be added, and most people in England would just use M7ABC. An example of intermediate, 2E0ABC for England. Let's look at Scotland, and again these are optional. You can optionally use the letter M when you are transmitting from Scotland. The easy way of remembering the M is Muck, which is very common for Scottish names. So as an example, a full licence holder in Scotland would be MM0ABC, or intermediate 2M0ABC. In Wales, the regional secondary locator is W. So for example, Foundation MW7ABC, or intermediate 2W0ABC. In Northern Ireland, it's not an N, it's the letter I, so MI0ABC or 2I0ABC. For the Isle of Man, the letter is D. The easy way of remembering that is D, Douglas, is the capital of the Isle of Man. Examples here, MD7ABC and 2D0ABC. Moving on to Jersey, that's a J, MJ0ABC or 2J0ABC. And for Guernsey, it's the letter U, which is the second letter of the word Guernsey. For example, MU7ABC or 2U0ABC. As I said at the start, these are optional, so in England again, you could use ME7 or just M7. Same in Wales, you could use MW7 or just M7. The only exception is for the intermediate call signs where you must have that letter, for example 2E0 or 2M0. Again, apart from for intermediate, the RSLs are optional in the UK and you use them to identify where you're transmitting from. These are examinable in the foundation exam, so you may want to familiarise yourself with these letters. So how do you use your amateur radio call sign? Well, the licence states that you must use your call sign as frequently as practicable so that your station is clearly identifiable at all times and in an appropriate format consistent with the mode of operation. As that's not very helpful, here is some guidance on when to use your call sign. It's advisable to give your call sign when you are calling for CQ to try and make contact with someone, or you make contact with an amateur for the first time. You should also give your call sign when you change frequency to a new frequency. You should also give your call sign when you change mode, including a change of digital protocols. For example, changing from FM to AM, or SSB, or into CW Morse code, or a data mode. Again, give your call sign. You should also give your call sign when you're changing to another regional secondary locator. An example here, if you're using a regional secondary locator and you're driving from, say, England to Wales, you should give your call sign again when you cross into Wales. You'd be switching from ME7ABC to MW7ABC. And you should also give your call sign if you're being supervised. We'll talk more about that shortly, and the supervisor of the call sign changes. When you start listening to amateur radio, you may find it's common practice for amateurs to give their call sign each over, although it's not actually required. On a net, which is a group of amateurs, you may find call signs are used more frequently.
M0PSX, M0LMR returning. Well, yes, congratulations to everyone who's recently passed their foundation licence in amateur radio. Congratulations, and hope you enjoy the hobby. There's so much to discover and enjoy. And just go with it and enjoy it, and congratulations again. Back to you, take M0PSX from myself, Dorothy, M0LMR.
And staying with call signs, we have something called call sign suffixes. If you're operating away from your main station address, it's recommended to use suffixes. These aren't optional, but they are quite common. Stroke M would indicate that you're mobile, either walking about, in a car, or on inland waters. For example, MM7ABC/M would be a Scottish radio amateur who is mobile. There's /A or stroke A if you're operating from an alternate postal address, for example a friend's house or a hotel. The call sign 2E0ABC/A would be an intermediate call sign holder in England who is operating at someone else's address. /P or stroke P would be temporary for an event perhaps in a field where there is no postcode. For example, M7PPP/P would be foundation in the UK operating at a temporary location. And there's also /MM, meaning maritime mobile, or from a vessel at sea. For example, M0QQQ/MM will be a full licence holder at sea. I mentioned the supervision clause a bit earlier. As a UK licence holder, you can let someone else use your call sign and your radio equipment as long as it's under your direct supervision. So let's look at an example. Pete, M0ABC, who is a full licence holder, could let Kelly, M7QQQ, who is a foundation licence holder, transmit using the call sign M0ABC as long as it's under Pete's direct supervision. So what does this mean in practice? Well, Kelly, the foundation licence holder, would be able to use the full licence condition restrictions, so would be able to operate at 1000 watts, as long as it's using the call sign M0ABC and it's under Pete's direct supervision. This arrangement also works the other way round, so here's another example. Kelly, M7QQQ, who holds a foundation licence, could let Pete, M0ABC, a full licence holder, transmit on the call sign M7QQQ under Kelly's direct supervision. In this case, Pete, the full licence holder, would be expected to drop down to the foundation restrictions, in this case 25 watts. So Pete could only use 25 watts using the call sign M7QQQ under Kelly's direct supervision. To be honest, the supervision clause doesn't often get used, but it is there in the licence and it is also examinable. So the key things to remember is as a licence holder you can let another person use your call sign under your direct supervision. If letting another person use your call sign under your supervision, then that person must adhere to your licence conditions. Moving on to something called the User Service Clause. In certain circumstances you are able to use amateur radio to assist with communications. Commonly this is in times of disaster or local, national or international emergency. If there is an emergency or an exercise run by the user services, you are allowed to encrypt messages if requested by the user service. So who are the user services? You don't need to know for the exam, but for your information, these are Category 1 responders, such as the police, ambulance, fire, coast guard, etc., principal local authorities, the environmental agency, the NHS. Also the British Red Cross, St John's Ambulance, the St Andrews Ambulance Association, the WRVS and the Salvation Army, as well as any government department and any Category 2 responder, for example utility companies, Network Rail, airport operators and harbour authorities. Moving on now to the encryption of messages. Secret codes that obscure the meaning of a message and the encryption of messages over amateur radio are not permitted. You should note the exceptions though. Morse code, for example, is okay, as it's not a secret code, as are some of the other codes that we use in amateur radio, such as CQ for calling out to someone to talk to, as well as what's called the Q codes. For the exam, remember that it's secret codes that are not permitted, as well as encryption. There are, however, a couple of exceptions for encryption. Encryption is permitted at the direct request of a user service, for example if they wanted to send a coded message during an emergency. Encryption is also allowed for the control of amateur radio satellites. We now move on to a relatively recent addition to the amateur radio licence called EMF compliance. The current amateur radio licence requires that all of our amateur radio equipment must not expose the general public to EMF, electromagnetic fields, over agreed international limits. The legislation applies to transmitted power levels over 10 watts EIRP. As you'll hopefully remember from our transmitters and receivers module, EIRP stands for Effective Isotropic Radiated Power. 10 watts EIRP is the equivalent of 6.1 watts ERP. A reminder that for the foundation exam, you're required to know that 10 watts EIRP is equivalent to 6.1 watts ERP. In this context, the public includes neighbours, visitors, family members, and of course everyone that comes along to visit an amateur radio station at a field day. All radio amateurs are required to complete an assessment on their amateur radio setup and keep a written record. If the assessment shows a potential risk, appropriate steps must be taken to ensure that your amateur radio transmissions are below those agreed limits. If everything's compliant and there's no further action required, then you must state the reasons on your written assessment. For example, stating that power levels are below that threshold. So let's take a look at how to complete an EMF assessment. The RSGB has created a free calculator. This is either an online calculator or a downloadable Excel spreadsheet. For a shortcut to the calculator, go to essexham.uk/EMFC. Using the calculator, you'll be required to enter the transmit power, the band you're operating on, the mode that you're operating, your antenna type, and your cable type. The calculator will then use the lookup tables to calculate the safe distances. If the calculator shows that you don't comply and that the public could be in range of your EMF emissions, then you may need to make some changes, such as changing the antenna height or reducing the transmit power. As a reminder, for powers over 6.1 watts ERP, that's 10 watts EIRP, you're required to make an assessment. We strongly advise you to make that assessment using the RSGB's calculator and download a copy as proof that you've completed the assessment. That's what you're required to know about EMF for your foundation exam. When you pass and get your amateur radio licence, you'll find a video on the Essex Ham website showing you how to complete an EMF assessment. We move now to the amateur radio schedule. The schedule forms part of the amateur radio licence, and there's one for each of the 3 licence levels. You get a copy of the schedule in the exam, and it's important that you know how to use it. Be aware that in amateur radio, your use of frequencies could be on a primary or secondary basis. If we look here, for instance, at 7 MHz, you will see that amateur radio operators are the primary users, whereas for 10 MHz, amateur radio usage is on a secondary basis, and the primary user has priority. There are a number of exceptions. You can see the first frequency allocation for amateurs has a limit of 1 watt ERP, effective radiated power of 1 watt. Down here, 431 to 432 is secondary for radio amateurs, and it cannot be used within 100 kilometres of Charing Cross in central London. This one is a very common exam question. You cannot operate on these frequencies within 100 kilometres of Charing Cross, and also note that if you're using a beam antenna, then ERP applies. And as a reminder, ERP is the transmit power multiplied by the gain of the antenna. You need to get yourself familiar with how to use the amateur radio schedule, as there's almost always at least one question in the exam on how to use it. Next, there's something called the band plan. This is not part of the licence, this is part of how to be a good radio amateur. You also get a copy of 2 of the band plans for your amateur radio exam. This is in place to ensure that the amateur bands are used fairly. At the top of the band, you will note there are the narrow band modes such as Morse code and data. The speech modes tend to be further down the band plan. You also need to watch the exceptions. Some of the frequencies, including the one highlighted here, are for propagation beacons. You shouldn't transmit on a beacon frequency, as these are used to tune in radio equipment. Next, there are repeaters. These allow you to boost your signal over a wider range, and we'll talk about those in a later module. Repeaters have an input and an output, and you need to be careful whereabouts you transmit to make sure that you don't interfere with repeater operation. Also, space comms. You will see there are some frequencies allowed for use for contacting satellites or for the International Space Station, and you should not transmit on these unless you're intending to transmit into space. Again, familiarise yourself with the band plan, and you are provided with a copy in the exam. So that's our look at licence conditions, and again a reminder, this covers 6 marks in the 26 question multiple choice test, so do make sure you understand this section well. The headlines to remember: the transmission of music, broadcasting, the use of secret codes or encryption, and transmitting from other countries is not permitted on the foundation licence. Ofcom has the power to inspect and close down your station, and also ask you to log your transmissions. You need to learn the UK call signs and those regional secondary locators. You need to perform EMF, electromagnetic field assessments, if you're operating over 10 watts EIRP, that's 6.1 watts ERP. And for the exam, make sure you use the schedule and the band plans that are provided for your exam, and watch out for those exceptions. If you're on our Foundation online course, you will find more information and a special video dedicated to using the band plan and schedule booklet. Do make sure you're very familiar with both of those documents. Thanks for watching this module on licence conditions. If you do have any questions, ask your Foundation online tutor, in the chat area on our online course, or in our Facebook group. Thanks for watching this latest module of our Foundation online course. We hope you found it useful. If you're looking for some more help with your studies, we do recommend the Foundation Study Guide, available from Amazon in Kindle or paperback format. Thanks for watching again, and best of luck with your studies. As a reminder, this video is part of the free Foundation online course. If you're studying for Foundation, sign up and get access to all of the course material, including slides, lessons, handouts, videos, quizzes, and our mocks. You can sign up at www.hamtrain.co.uk.